in the late in the end of the 19th beginning well yeah, end of the 19th century, the late 1800s, Jack London was a young writer. He along with he got caught up in the Yukon Gold Rush, and went up into to strike it rich in Alaska. Along over a 3-year period, about 100,000 miners just flooded that region. He was one of them, and he never struck it rich, but he did have quite an adventure and get a lot of life experience, which he later infused into his stories. One of those being The White Silence, which is one of his short stories he wrote about the Yukon. And he was a mainstream writer, but there are Christian themes in his stories. Now, in The White Silence, London teaches us that faith to overcome is faith with action. Faith to overcome is faith with action, and he shows us this in a lot of different ways. So one of the ways that that London teaches us and shows us that faith to overcome is faith with action is that he shows us, first of all, that action is needed before emotion. Okay, so in life, when we run into trouble, when we run into adversity, action is more important than emotion. Action should come before emotion, because we can get caught up in emotion and get into trouble. For example, in the story, it says, strong man, brute though he was. Now again, this is Mason is the hero of this story. He's the musher. He's the dog. He's running the dog team on a sled up through the Yukon. It says, strong man, brute that he was, capable of felling an ox at a blow. He could not bear to beat the poor animals, but humored them as a dog driver rarely does, and almost wept with them in their misery. So he has compassion for his dog team and their suffering and their misery, and he almost wept with them. Okay, he didn't stop his journey, his voyage, get down and weep with his dogs in 60 below temperatures. No, he stays focused on action. Even though he's a man of compassion, he stays focused on action. So it says here there were many attempts to start the load. So he's trying to get this show on the road. He's making many attempts to get his load going. He's not getting caught up in emotion. So another way that London shows us that faith to overcome is faith with action is another example is let your actions speak. Let your actions speak. So London writes, the afternoon wore on, and with the awe born of the white silence, the voiceless travelers bent to their work. Nature has many tricks wherein she convinces man of his finity, the ceaseless flow of the tides, the fury of the storm, the shock of the earthquake, the long roll of heaven's artillery. But the most tremulous, the most stupefying of all is the passive phase of white silence. All movement ceases. The sky clears, the heavens are as brass, the slightest whisper seems sacrilege, and man becomes timid, affrighted at the sound of his own voice. Sole speck of life journeying across the ghostly wastes of a dead world. He trembles at his audacity, realizes that his is a maggot's life and nothing more. Strange thoughts arise, unsummoned, and the mysteries of all things strives for utterance. And the fear of death, of God, of the universe comes over him, and the hope of the resurrection and the life, the yearning for immortality, the vain striving of the imprisoned essence. It is then, if ever, man walks alone with God. So a couple of points here with that passage. It says, and man becomes timid, affrighted at the sound of his own voice. So he's out there in the vast white silence. It's utterly still, utterly silent, total silence. And it's so pure and beautiful and utterly dead silent that man becomes affrighted at his own voice. So what's his response? It says here, soul speck of life journeying across the ghostly waste. So he focuses on action. Let your actions speak. That's what he does. And then it says here, well, another key point of how faith to overcome is faith with action. Another example of that is how he shows action defeats fear. Because it says the vain striving, well, it says, and then the fear of death, of God, of the universe, overcomes him. The hope of the resurrection and the life, the yearning for immortality. All of this is going on. And then it says the vain striving of imprisoned essence. And then if ever man walks alone with God. So it talks about man walking with God, action. Focusing on action defeats fear. Now that can be a spiritual action also, in the sense, Enoch is known as the Old Testament as he walked with God. And that's what we see here, another outworking of that concept. So faith to overcome is faith with action. And another example of that in London's story is it's action. We already talked about emotion. We see it again here, action without emotion. And London writes, already penitent, because when London gets angry at his dog, he lashes out at it. And then he says, and he reacted to his emotion. In the Bible, we saw that when Moses got frustrated and he hit the rock, and because of his outburst of temper, and God rebuked him, and because of that, Moses never entered the promised land. So we see here it says already. So again, action without emotion. He's already made the mistake of outbursting with emotion. So what's his response? Already penitent for his angry action, but too stubborn to make amends, Mason toiled on at the head of the cavalcade. Okay, he made a mistake. He gets back to action. He gets busy. He doesn't whine, and he doesn't get caught up in the emotion, whine and feel sorry for himself. No, he gets busy. Action without emotion. So again, faith to overcome is faith with action. We see that another example of that is action with few words. So London writes, little was said. Those of the Northland are early taught of the futility of words and the inestimable value of deeds. So we speak with our actions. Another example of that. And then we need calculated action. London writes, but never had he faced so. This is after Mason is in mortal. He's injured and paralyzed at the point of death. The kid takes over. He's there along with the Mason's wife, and the kid the pregnant wife, and so the kid has to make a quick decision. He's got to figure out what to do, and so it says here, but never had faced so stiff a problem as this. And in the abstract, it was a plain mathematical proposition: 3 lives against 1 doomed man. In London stories, the natives will typically just abandon or shoot a dying person, just in the same mold as the herds will abandon a wounded animal, the herds of caribou. So we see this in London stories. And so we have this kid, and he's saying 3 lives. He's weighing the numbers: 3 lives against 1 doomed person. So he's taking action, but it's calculated action. Okay, we see in the Bible with Nehemiah, he's gonna build the wall around Jerusalem, and he's a man of patience, and he doesn't take action until he's run the numbers. Okay, he will not begin until he's counted the cost. So another example of how London shows us that faith to overcome is faith with action is prayer. He writes, though he prayed for a moose, he's out. This is out on a hunt. The kid out on a hunt. Though he prayed for a moose, all game seemed to have deserted the land. And nightfall found the exhausted man crawling into camp, heavy-hearted. So he prayed for a moose. Now, sometimes we don't get exactly what we pray for, but prayer with action. It's faith and action. Very important. And then it also says at nightfall found him, the exhausted man, crawling into the camp. So it should be tenacious action. Tenacious action. Even to the point of crawling. All right. So London gives us another example of faith to overcome is faith in action. And the example he gives us is action with discipline. Okay? Disciplined action, very important. And this is true in the spiritual life. The faith, the disciplines of prayer, the disciplines of silence, the disciplines of fasting. There are many disciplines of the spiritual life. And London writes here, the dogs had broken the iron rule of their masters and were rushing the grub. He joined the issue with a rifle reversed, and the hoary game of natural selection was played out with all the ruthlessness of its primeval environment. Rifle and axe went up and down, hit or missed with monotonous regularity. Lithe bodies flashed, wild eyes and dripping fangs, and man and beast fought for supremacy to the bitterest conclusion. So what we have here is the dogs, their discipline broke, and as a result, they beat him. They were beating him with the back end of the rifle, and the whip flashed in the air. So there was discipline. Discipline was restored. With the girl and the kid were restoring discipline, just like faith to overcome requires disciplined action. So another example of how faith to overcome is faith with action. The example is tenacious action with suffering. So sometimes we're going to suffer. We take action and we suffer. But we have to continue. We have to fight on. We have to fight with even more tenacity, even despite the suffering, and never quit. For example, it says here, morning brought fresh trouble. The animals were turning on each other. Carmen, who still clung to her slender thread of life, was down by the pack. This is one of the weak dog. The lash fell among them unheeded. They cringed. They cried under the blows, but refused to scatter till the last wretched bit had disappeared. Bones, hide, hair, everything. So these dogs are hungry, and they're wolves. When there's a weak wolf, they'll turn on him and rip him to pieces and come away with a mouthful of flesh and blood dripping off the canines, because they're wolves, right? And so they're fighting. They're in this feeding frenzy, eating the dying wolf. And meanwhile, the kid is beating them with a rifle, and the girl is flashing the whip, and the whip is falling across their backs. And the wolves are yelping with pain, but they don't quit. They keep fighting. They keep fighting until every last bit of that wolf is devoured. And in a sense, that's a microcosm of life. I mean, we take action, we suffer, we just have to persevere and fight even with more tenacity. So, action. We take action as a weapon against fear. That's another example of how faith to overcome is faith with action. It's how we use it against fear. Because it says here, as you're out there, the journey continues into the great white silence, hundreds of miles of utter whiteness, 60 below zero, death a possibility at any time. It says, silence seemed to sneer, and a great fear overcame him. And what did he do? It says, the Malamute kid lashed the dogs into a wild gallop as he fled across the snow. So he gets right back into action. So we stay with, action is great. It keeps us focused on moving forward, on progress, on a goal achievement, as opposed to dwelling in introspection and focusing on fear. And that which we focus on grows. So it's just the opposite. It protects us from that risk. So thanks for listening. And remember, faith to overcome is faith with action.